The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. This is Matthew Alexander from the U.S. EPA's Office of Groundwater and Drinking Water. I'd like to welcome everyone to the second webinar in the Reducing Disinfection Byproducts Through Optimization webinar series. The focus of today's webinar is approaches to prioritize plant optimization efforts. So the primary learning objective of this webinar series is to share optimization-based tools and approaches for disinfection byproduct control. These tools and approaches have been developed in partnership with state drinking water programs through the area-wide optimization program. As I previously mentioned, this is the second webinar in a series of 4 webinars. Presentations will be provided by both EPA and state drinking water program staff. Content from each webinar will build on the previous webinar. Supporting information such as study protocols and spreadsheets will also be made available. And the intended audience are states and water systems who are challenged with DBP compliance. The first webinar introduced a general process that may be used to reduce disinfection byproducts in public water systems through optimizing existing treatment and distribution system facilities. Today's webinar will introduce approaches to prioritize water treatment plant optimization efforts. All webinars will take place from 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time and will take approximately 2 hours, and that includes a question and answer session. All webinars will also be recorded so that they will be available to be viewed at a later date. Today's webinar will be made available tomorrow on ASBR's website. Participants must register for each individual webinar through ASBR's website as well. If you have any questions as we go through today's webinar, please submit them on the questions panel, on the control panel on your screen. We really encourage you not to wait until the end of the webinar to submit questions. Submitting questions in advance allows us to more efficiently manage the question and answer session. So we'd appreciate if you could do that as questions come up as you're going through the webinar today. So these are the learning objectives for webinar 2. The first learning objective is to understand the overall approach to reduce DBPs through optimization. This approach was first introduced in webinar 1, but we are going to build on that today in webinar 2. In a few minutes, I'm going to briefly review information that we introduced during the first webinar. The second learning objective for today's webinar is to introduce approaches to prioritize DBP optimization control strategies in a water treatment plant. This includes reviewing historical water quality data. Allison Dugan from US EPA will introduce this during presentation 2. In presentation 3, Aaron Hilborn from Arkansas Department of Health will introduce how to use a surrogate DBP monitoring tool. And in presentation 4, Jackie Logston and David Messer from Kentucky Department of Environmental Protection will introduce studies that can help assess the potential effectiveness of implementing control strategies. But before I review the information introduced during the first webinar, I'd like to share EPA's disclaimer. The information in this presentation has been reviewed and approved for public dissemination in accordance with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. The views expressed in this presentation are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the views or policies of the agency. Any mention of trade names or commercial products does not constitute an EPA endorsement or recommendation for use. So during webinar 1, we introduced a process to reduce DBPs through optimizing existing treatment and distribution system facilities. If you're unable to review this webinar, you can access it through ASBR's website. So the overall process consists of 2 stages. The first stage is diagnosing where DBP formation occurs. That is it predominantly in the water treatment plant? Is it in the distribution system, or both? Doing this allows water systems to more effectively prioritize their efforts to reduce DBPs. And the second stage is evaluating and implementing control strategies to reduce DBP formation. The first step in diagnosing DBP formation is to conduct diagnostic monitoring studies. This consists of collecting a DBP sample from the distribution system entry point and the maximum residence time locations to determine where the majority of DBP formation is occurring. In addition to the diagnostic monitoring study, an optional initial step is to conduct a distribution system influent hold study. Conducting this study may provide additional information related to disinfectant stability and DBP formation. Based on our experience and feedback from state drinking water programs, we suggest that systems initially focus on in-plant optimization approaches if plant effluent THM levels are greater than 30 parts per billion. Similarly, if the plant effluent HA5 concentration is greater than 20 parts per billion, we suggest they focus on treatment optimization. Keep in mind these are just guidelines and may not apply to all systems. If a system determines that they need to start with treatment optimization, the primary areas of focus are optimizing their oxidation and disinfection process and DBP precursor removal. These topics will be covered in more detail later in this webinar series. The focus of today's webinar is going to be prioritizing DBP optimization control strategies in a water treatment plant. This will include reviewing historical water quality data, in-plant monitoring using a DBP surrogate, and approaches to evaluate the effectiveness of potential control strategies. So this concludes the introduction portion of the webinar. Now Allison Dugan from US EPA is going to provide a presentation on how to review historical water quality data to prioritize DBP optimization control strategies in a water treatment plant.
Great, thanks, Matt. As Matt said, today I'm going to talk about the data that are often considered when prioritizing DBP control strategies. And before I get into this, I really want to give some credit to the states of Alabama and Kentucky who have water systems that provided data that we will be highlighting today. So thank you very much. It provides for some great examples for our discussion. And I am not, oh, there we go. Okay, here we go. All right, so before we get into the data though, let's just talk a little bit about the optimization strategies and where they're applied in the plant. Matt started to talk about this in his presentation, but basically we've got two main strategies we can look at. The first is optimizing oxidation or disinfection in the plant. And often that occurs throughout the plant. In this generic schematic, we're showing a pre-oxidant location, an intermediate disinfectant application, and a post-disinfectant addition application. And then the other main strategy is optimizing DBP precursor or TOC removal. And this is typically achieved through the coagulation, flocculation, sedimentation process. So really the basic approach that water systems can take is pretty limited, but there are endless combinations of oxidants and coagulant products that a system can use. And so that's where it's important to look at the data and think carefully about the approaches that a system might use. So along with a variety of treatment options, there are also many unintended consequences that are associated with these two main DBP control strategies, as we've shown here on this table. And here we've listed some of the unintended consequences as well as the two main strategies. And so for some of these, such as reduced disinfection or increased biogrowth, they're primarily a result of optimizing oxidation or disinfection, whereas the unintended consequence related to quantity and quality of sludge is more a result of optimizing TOC removal. But other unintended consequences can occur with either of these strategies. And, you know, we've listed some of the more common ones. We've left a row here for others just to emphasize that there's a lot of things that can happen as you go through this process of optimizing a water plant to reduce disinfection byproducts. And we just are trying to raise awareness here so that it doesn't become a significant operational issue. And the bottom line is that they should be considered as much as possible when you're preparing to implement a strategy and also through the historical review, data review process. So given this background, let's talk about the approach for reviewing historical water quality data. And it's in order for us to be better informed as we prioritize the various DBP control strategies. So ideally, the data should be plotted to better identify trends. It's really hard to pick out what's happening trend-wise, especially from tabular data or from an MOR or a daily bench sheet. And then ideally, too, you have 1 year or more of historical data, but a data set that shows seasonal trends will be sufficient for what we're doing here. And it really doesn't matter what spreadsheet tool or SCADA or what you use to generate the data. The important thing is to review it and hopefully look at it in a graphical format. So we know that water systems generate lots of data, but luckily we can be strategic to some extent with this effort. So specifically, the data to review typically falls into a couple categories. The first is looking at TOC removal related parameters. So that would include raw and treated TOC, coagulant dose and type, and maybe coagulation pH. And then we have the disinfection related parameters, which includes chlorine dose and residual data at all of the applicable locations through the plant, as well as the parameters that a system uses to calculate CT. And then we also want to look at water quality data related to other treatment objectives or the potential unintended consequences that I talked about a few slides ago. And that might include settled and finished water turbidity, inorganic parameters that a system might be tracking, possibly bromide, iron, manganese, explosion-related, others, and algal toxin data, if that's something a system is tracking. And there might be other treatment objectives as well that a system's focused on. So the information related to that should also be reviewed. So now I want to demonstrate how we do this with an example water system. So this is our example plant schematic. And the first step in this process is to start with the schematic and try to visualize the processes through the plant, key treatment and sample locations that might potentially impact our optimization efforts. So we want to carefully review treatment relative to the DBP optimization strategies. So in other words, where is the plant likely removing TOC and what oxidants are they adding and which ones? So in this particular example, we have a plant that's treating a river source, and they add permanganate in their wet well, and then in their static mix area, they add caustic, alum, and chlorine prior to the flocculation sedimentation process. And then they add chlorine again ahead of the filters. So thinking about this in the context of where they're likely getting TOC removal, it's probably through the flocculation sedimentation process. They don't add powdered activated carbon, which some systems do try to use for TOC removal. And in this particular case, the plant would probably be challenged to do so based on what they're adding early on the plant. But it's hard to really know from the schematic, so the schematic is just a starting point. And as I mentioned, they're adding permanganate as well as chlorine in several locations through the plant. So in addition to reviewing the overall treatment schematic, it's also important to think about how effectively the system is operating to remove TOC. And this is often done through a combination of reviewing historical data and talking with the plant operators. So in doing so, you want to first consider, are they even achieving enhanced coagulation? And if so, is this being done intentionally so that they're in that they're really focused on TOC treatment and removal, or as part of normal turbidity operations? And if it's the latter, maybe they're achieving enhanced coagulation, but not necessarily deliberately. And if that's the case, it's possible they might be able to remove even more TOC than they currently are. So regardless, you also want to look at coagulant dose, type, and pH, and think about things like, is the coagulant dose consistent? If it's not and it varies, why is that? Is that because they're changing the coagulant dose for TOC removal or in response to turbidity increases in the raw water, or what's the objective for their coagulation approach? And then also consider whether they're using a coagulant that's effective for TOC removal. And if so, how is that verified? Or are they using a coagulant that they've used for years and years, and TOC removal hasn't necessarily been a primary consideration? And then some systems also benefit from looking at coagulation pH and whether that's in a desired range for TOC removal. Other systems don't necessarily have to go down that path, but that can definitely be another consideration. And just a note from the Enhanced Coagulation Guidance Manual, the optimal range for coagulation pH can range from 5.5 to 7.5, depending on the alkalinity of the water. So we're not necessarily saying that they'll have to adjust the pH to achieve better TO2 removal, but that can certainly be a consideration for some systems. And so another thing to consider is whether there are other potential treatment strategies that a system could use for TO2 removal, such as powdered activated carbon or some other carbon application. And then also, of course, you want to look at, in addition to looking at the potential to optimize or improve TO2 removal, you want to consider potential unintended consequences related to this strategy, such as changes that might be happening to turbidity removal, corrosion treatment, allotoxin control, and others. So, thinking about all this, let's look at some historical data from our example water system. This plot shows source and treated TOC over a 10-month period. I talked about earlier having 1 year worth of data, but definitely you want to have enough data to show seasonal trends, which we're capturing here, and to be confident that the data that you're looking at is probably representative of how they're historically been operating the plant. So the source TOC, which is shown in blue, varies quite a bit through the year, ranging from as low as 1.5 milligrams per liter and to as high as 4 milligrams per liter. Looking at the treated TOC, it's important to assess whether that tracks the raw water levels or not. And you'll see here that in the first part of the year, the treated TOC does track what's happening in the raw water. But then later in the year, the system was able to keep the treated TOC, which is shown in this pinkish salmon kind of color, at a more consistent level, ranging between 1 and 1.5. So this trend implies that they might have been deliberate about TOC removal later in the year. But you'd really need to talk with the treatment plant operator to really understand that. But looking at the historical data definitely provides some questions to follow up on. So we also like to look at the coagulant dose to see whether it remains constant or is adjusted. And again, if it's adjusted, what's the treatment objective? Is it turbidity removal or TOC removal? And in this particular example, we've got the coagulant dose shown with the green triangles. And it was consistent for the first part of the year, but then was adjusted, seemingly in response to a spike in raw water TOC that they had in the springtime. But again, you'd need to talk to the operator about this to understand whether that was the case or if it was adjusted for some other reason. And then finally, for our example system, we include the coagulation pH, which is about 7.5, and it's pretty consistent through the through this analysis or through this time period. And it doesn't really seem to have a negative impact on TOC removal, or maybe any impact on TOC removal based on the treated TOC shown throughout this time period. But again, for some systems, pH adjustment might be incorporated or at least evaluated as part of a control strategy to optimize TOC removal. And this can be done through jar testing, so it's not necessarily something that needs to start right away, full scale for the system. So this kind of snapshot of historical data is the main treatment data we look at for this TOC removal strategy. Of course, if they have any anticipated unintended consequences, you'd want to look at those issues as well, either by plotting historical data or through more discussions with the plant operations staff. So now let's shift gears and look at the other strategy, optimizing oxidation or disinfection. And as we've discussed, most systems add chlorine or some other oxidant at a pre-location, which we define as prior to TOC removal, typically, which is prior to top of filter location, as well as intermediate and or post locations, which is often how CT, disinfection credit, and plant effluent residual is maintained. So primarily we look at the historical data such as chlorine dose and residual, and we think about where they're adding it and how much they add, and then what are the treatment objectives for maintaining a chlorine residual at various locations through the plant. For example, some plants like to maintain a residual coming out of their sedimentation basins for biogrowth control. Others have a target residual at their filter effluent location for other treatment objectives. But it's good to really look closely at how much chlorine they're adding and what kind of residuals they typically maintain through the plant at the locations they're monitoring, of course. And then also you want to look carefully at CT and how that's achieved through the plant and what kind of inactivation levels they've historically achieved. And then finally, if the plant uses any other oxidants, you want to note what they're using, what dose, and what is the treatment objective for using that oxidant. So looking at some example historical data from our example system, let's start with chlorine dose data and think about how much chlorine they're adding and potentially why. So this plot again shows chlorine dose over, again, a 10-month period. And the axis here ranges from 0 to 14 milligrams per liter because in January and then again in May, they reported doses in the 10 to 13 milligram per liter range. This plot is showing a pre-chlorine dose with these hollow circles, and that is actually a combination of what they're adding in their rapid mix and their top of filter dose for this particular analysis. And then they also have included some post-chlorine data, which they're adding at their filter effluent. And so then the total dose that they're adding is shown with this blue shading. So from August through October, they added all their chlorine, which is around 6 milligrams per liter in the pre-location. But starting in October, they split the dose, adding about half at the pre-location and half at the post-location. So other things to note is the relatively high doses that they added in January and then again in May. And this would be something to ask the system about, why were the doses so high? Was there some other treatment objective they were trying to meet, resulting in a need for a higher chlorine dose, potentially inorganic demand, or maybe biogrowth concerns? It's hard to know really without talking with the operations staff. And it might actually require going back into some plant logs and looking more closely because maybe off the top of their head the operators don't know, but it's definitely something to investigate. So another thing to note when you start to look at some of the historical data is that their control over chlorine dosing was not very consistent over this time period. And so that might be something that they'll need to focus on if they do pursue optimization and try to dial in their dosing a little more carefully. And that's just something to be aware of as you go down this path. So this plot is showing residuals through the plant from our example system. So the settled water residuals are shown with the hollow boxes, and the finished water residuals are these solid boxes on the plot. And what's interesting here, the range here is from 0 to 3.5 milligrams per liter, and in the first couple months, the settled and finished water residuals reported as being the same, and then they drifted apart. About that time, they started to split their dose. So this was probably the result of a deliberate treatment change, but definitely something to ask the plant about. And then recall in the previous slide, they had spikes in chlorine dose both in the January timeframe and again in May. However, the finished water residual, which again is the solid boxes, doesn't really change. So that implies there is something causing a pretty high chlorine demand in the plant. And again, that's something to ask about when you talk with the operations staff. And finally, notice there's some variability in the plant effluent residual. Although their finished water target is 1.6, as shown by this solid line, typically the system runs somewhat higher than that. So this is also something to ask about whether they're deliberately operating at a higher level than the target that they've reported, or just how they operate. And again, the variability in the finished water residual might imply that they'll have to think about why it's so variable from day to day, and whether or not that could be possibly, that variability could be lessened if they do pursue optimization, just as they might have less room for error in their chlorine dose and residuals if they go down this path. So now I want to look at CT or inactivation ratio for the example plant. And what this is plotting on this axis is the inactivation ratio, which is the measured CT divided by the required CT for that same 10-month period. And the system has a goal to provide an inactivation ratio of 1.5, which is the red line on the plot. This system achieves their overall inactivation ratio, which is the shaded blue portion of the plot, from 3 segments in the plant. So in other words, they're measuring chlorine residual, pH, and temperature, which are the parameters needed to calculate CT, at 3 locations through the plant, which includes their sud basin effluent, which is the green symbols, their filter effluent, which are the black hollow symbols, which kind of look like a thick black line through parts of the air, and then at the end of their clear well, which is shown by these purple stars. So the first step for assessing the potential to implement a DBP control strategy related to optimizing disinfection is to assess the overall amount of CT that the system has historically achieved, but also where through the plant are they getting that credit. So in our example system, we see that they achieve much of their disinfection credit through their sud basins, again the green line, and their clear well, purple area. And we see that they contributed somewhat equally to the overall disinfection that they're achieving in the plant. And this is something to be mindful of if we're going to look at optimizing chlorine addition at the head of the plant. And then, as expected, the contribution to CT from their filters is really pretty minimal, especially in the winter months. So they achieved an inactivation ratio as high as 25 in the warmer summer months, but it dropped to below 5 in the cooler months, starting around November. So this implies there's not a lot of room to reduce the residual that they carry through the plant in the cooler months and maintain the same level of CT that they had historically. And so that should be a consideration too as you pursue an optimizing disinfection strategy. And it might suggest that they should be thinking about a seasonal strategy to control DBPs in the summer. In the warmer months, there might be some room to back off on the amount of disinfection they're providing. But then in the winter months, maintain what they historically have to still meet CT. And then, of course, if you are a water system listening to this webinar, you've got to check with your primacy agency about any changes that might be made in your plant that will impact CT. So the DBP control strategy related to optimizing disinfection can also potentially impact plant effluent residual, both the actual residual leaving the plant as well as how stable the disinfectant residual is out in the distribution system once it leaves the plant. So therefore, it's important not to overlook historical distribution system residual data to assess whether this might be a problem for the system. In doing so, be sure to consider the minimum residual requirement that's set by the primacy agency. Again, if you're a water plant, that has to be considered. The impact of DBP formation may not be significant. If you're pursuing a strategy where you're lowering the finished water residual, you may or may not have a significant impact on DBP formation. So that's something to be considering as well, and possibly an argument to just leave the finished water residual at the same level that it's always been at. Your impact that you're going to have on DBP formation can be assessed to some extent through running a hold study, which we discussed in the first webinar, but it's definitely a consideration, is how much is this really going to impact DBP formation. And then finally, historical disinfectant residual data may not always capture water quality through the entire system. And that's something I want to show in the next few slides. So for a different example water system, we have some distribution system chlorine residual data, which is based on regulatory monitoring that the system has done. And this is within a state that requires a minimum distribution system free chlorine residual of 0.2 milligrams per liter. So that would be down in this lower area of the plot. And on this plot, we've included plant effluent residuals from 2 water plants. This system had 2 water plants, and so that's shown in the green and the blue lines. And then we've also shown the average monthly distribution system residual in pink, and then the maximum and minimum residuals shown in black and blue, respectively. And then we also have included a legend for the number of samples the system reported as being below the minimum residual requirement of 0.2 milligrams per liter. And so over the 2-year period where we're looking at this data, none of their distribution system residuals were below that level based on their required regulatory monitoring. So overall, the system looks great, and like they might have some room to reduce their finished water their finished water chlorine residual. However, during the same time, the system suspected they had some areas of their distribution system potentially with lower chlorine residuals than what they were routinely monitoring, and they wanted to get a better sense of this. So they conducted what we call investigative sampling, which is really focused on looking at areas in the system that might have high water age and poor water quality. And they did this in part to prepare to implement a DBP control strategy that included lowering their finished water residual. So they wanted to be really sure they weren't compromising water quality out in the distribution system. So as they went through this process during the first few months of investigative sampling, they found 22 samples below the 0.2 milligram per liter level, which was not entirely surprising to them, but definitely not indicative in looking at their historical chlorine residual monitoring. So in response to this, they focused a lot on improving water quality in those areas of the system. And then in the subsequent years of monitoring, the number of samples that they measured below with residuals less than 0.2 milligram per liter dropped dramatically. So their efforts definitely paid off, but they were also very glad that they had done some additional investigative sampling before they implemented a control strategy related to lowering your finished water residual. And so I think the take home here is when you're considering finished water residual and flexibility to lower it, you really want to be confident that the distribution system residual data that you have to work with reflects performance across the entire system, and that water quality out in the distribution system will not be compromised. So I know we probably sound a little bit like a broken record with the whole idea of unintended consequences and thinking about those, but I just want to stress that it's really important to think about the impact of these control strategies on other treatment objectives, especially the ones that are measured by compliance, but also the ones that are maybe more aesthetic considerations. And so we call this simultaneous compliance, which basically means compliance with all of the existing Safe Drinking Water Act regulations. And so one example of that is turbidity, which might increase due to changing pre-oxidation or enhancing TOC removal and going through that process. So in response to that, or being aware of that, it's really important to monitor settled and finished water turbidity before and after implementing DBP control strategies to make sure this isn't compromised. And of course, you want to confirm that you're achieving simultaneous compliance with all of the other treatment objectives as well as you pursue DBP optimization. So in summary, reviewing historical water quality data is an important step in prioritizing and evaluating control strategies. Water systems do have a lot of data that they generate, but you really want to focus on the data that will support potential DBP control strategies and identification or gaining an understanding, rather, of potential unintended consequences. And going through this process and having a better understanding of all this will give you a really good idea of the potential for a plant to optimize to reduce DBPs. And it also will likely highlight some things that you want to look out for as treatment changes are made through DBP optimization. So with that, we will have some questions at the end of the webinar, but if you're thinking of anything that's burning right now, please submit it through the question panel so that we can be sure to answer it at the end of the webinar. So with that, I think we're going to turn the presentation over to, or the webinar over to Erin Hilborn from the Arkansas Department of Health. And, okay.
All right, my name is Erin, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how to use some in-plant monitoring to potentially improve your disinfection byproduct formation. All right, so you know, one thing to think about is Allison and Matt already talked about this a little bit, but you deciding where to monitor is a big deal, and where to seek improvement matters. DBPs are monitored in a distribution system, and so I think a lot of times people see, this is a site that I'm having trouble with. I should pursue improvement there, and a lot of time work ends up being done at the site where problems are occurring, but that may not be the most applicable place to pursue improvement. If water is leaving the treatment plant, like they said, at an elevated level, and you're just working on improving water that's already in not great shape with regards to DBPs, you may be spinning your wheels a little bit and wasting some time and energy. So, monitoring at the plant can be beneficial. And we've got a couple of case studies that we'll show in a couple of minutes that will kind of highlight the benefits of doing this. All right, so some things to think about are DBP samples, just like the logistics of getting those taken, analyzed, and the results available to you or the water system. And typically it's not a very quick turnaround time. It can take as long as a month at some points in times. That can make the process difficult and long, especially if you're trying to make an operational change. Operators are wanting to see, did this improve my issues, or did it not? And if you're getting certified samples into a lab and then waiting a month to get them back, it can end up slowing you down significantly. Whereas if you had a surrogate, something that is quick and somewhat easy to produce, you can make changes, assess how you're doing on a much quicker basis. And we've got a specific case study that addresses this we'll see in just a moment. Another thing to consider is just the cost. Certified DBP samples are somewhat costly to have sent off and returned to you, whereas THM Plus, the surrogate that we're going to talk about, is significantly cheaper. All right, so Hawk has developed a method called THM Plus. It accounts for the 4 analytes that make up total trihalomethanes, the one that's regulated, as well as some other DBPs. And the turnaround time is pretty quick. We say right here, results are available within an hour. That is, if you're new to the method, it can be longer than that. Once you get a little bit more familiar with the process, you can get it down to around an hour or so. It should be noted that these can't be used for compliance monitoring. These are for investigative purposes and operational checkups only. They're a very good tool, but they're not available to be used as compliance sampling. One thing to think about when you're doing this is go ahead and collecting your certified samples alongside these, or collecting some Hawk THM Plus samples alongside your certified samples, especially if you're interested in pursuing the method. It might give you a chance to practice on some and then compare the results to a certified sample that you'll get later in time. Excuse me. We call it a surrogate, so there's going to be problems. It can't be perfect, otherwise that's what we would use for compliance purposes. What are some of the problems that we face here? The main one is there's multiple interferences, and that can make the data difficult to interpret. But as you get more comfortable with it, you begin to get a feel for what is good data versus bad. Another thing that is important to do is to practice, and I'll talk about that a little bit more here in a minute, but I've mentioned a moment ago that taking them alongside some certified samples is a good idea, and I would like to stress that again, that is an opportunity to get numbers that you can actually stand on and compare, how is my technique and method doing on THM Plus. All right, so where does it shine? Where does Hot THM Plus really provide a strong data that is useful? So for me, I like to use it for a profiling as a comparative process throughout the treatment process, and we'll see that in just a moment on these case studies. I will say that in my time working with disinfection byproducts, this method is the single most powerful tool that I had while I was doing this. It provided us the most information and bang for the buck through profiling that we had access to. All right, so let's look at a couple of charts as far as how did the method perform. So this is a graph of a THM Plus, as you can see on the bottom, versus TTHM certified samples, and this is you've got an R-squared value here of 88, and you'll also see this is in Alabama. They have really got it going on in Alabama. That is some really good data. Very the plot is very close to the line that you would like to hit. A 1-to-1 ratio. So they're doing really good. So now a slide that is not so much fun to present if you're sitting in Arkansas, but this data was taken from Arkansas, and you can see the spray on this is significant. So this is another one of the downsides is you've got to learn that sometimes the data is very accurate, and sometimes it's not. And there's just not really an easy way to say it other than you just got to get familiar and comfortable with the fact of, sometimes you're going to get numbers and you'll think, well, maybe we should rerun it. And a lot of times that's a good idea. And sometimes it's a product of technique, and sometimes it's a product of just the water quality, interferences. So it's just a difficult thing to get comfortable with. So, you can see here R-squared of 19 versus an 88. Alabama really showing Arkansas how it's done here, which is, I'm sitting in the middle of Arkansas, so thumbs up for Alabama. All right, so, what are some things that we can do to improve our results if we're going to do this sample? First thing we can do is make sure that we've got chlorine demand-free amber glass bottles. Just make sure your bottles are clean and that you won't have any demand from chlorine in there. The other thing to do is make sure that you get your bottles completely filled, no airspace. These things are volatile. THMs will come out into the air, and if you have bubbles in there, you're giving it an opportunity to volatilize into the air, and then it won't be a part of your sample. And then, this is a method that can be done in the field. This picture here was taken at a water treatment plant, and samples were taken immediately and then analyzed. If that's the case, you don't have to worry about the chlorine demand-free amber glass bottles, the no bubbles, and refrigerating. But if you're going to collect these samples and run them at a later time, the samples must be iced and the other precautions taken as well to make sure that you're not unintentionally providing an opportunity to either increase or lower the concentration that you're going to read at the end of the study. What else can you do? Practice. I mentioned this a minute ago. It's a big one. Taking them next to your certified samples as a split sample will start to give you a good feel for how confident you can be in your numbers, if you're getting the hang of it or not. And it also gives you a chance to kind of get a feel for, at this water system, at this water quality, I can start to figure out that I run maybe 15 to 20% high here on CHM Plus versus a certified sample. It's just, and every water quality is different. Sometimes you'll go somewhere and you can get the numbers to just match up great, and sometimes you can't. Another one here is to read the method carefully. It's a little bit more involved as far as a procedure as some of the things that we do. It's not bad, but reading the instructions thoroughly is a really good idea. A couple of the big ones are if you refrigerate your samples, there's a part where you boil the sample cells. That's a longer process if they're iced versus uniced. And, there's 4 reagents to this method. Reagent 2 is always held in refrigeration until you are ready to perform the method. At that point in time, it needs to be brought to room temperature prior to using it. So there's a few things there. We said an hour is how long you need to do this. When we first started doing this in Arkansas, we were providing ourselves an entire morning or an entire afternoon to get through one sample set. And, obviously that's trimmed down quite a bit, but that was, the start of it, getting reagent 2 out of the fridge, getting the water up to boiling, several steps that you have to do in advance before you can actually start the method. And then another thing is to measure the chlorine residual when the DBP samples are collected. It's a good practice to just get to the habit of doing. If you're going to take a THM Plus sample, just go ahead and grab a chlorine while you're there. A lot of times you can start to correlate, higher THM Plus results to higher chlorine residuals and get a feel for how they correlate. All right, so let's look at a couple of case studies. And the first one we'll talk about is a treatment plant with 4 monitoring locations. There were 3 pieces of data taken at each location. So they took haloacetic acids, total trihalomethanes, and free fluorine. And so if we kind of go through them one by one, we'll start with the fluorine, the blue bar. And so we can see that their free fluorine coming in is, above 2.5 on their flocculated water. Going into settled water, there's a fair amount of demand there. You're going to drop down to between 1.5 and 1, and then kind of stays somewhat steady, and it looks like it gets boosted back up to around 2 whenever it leaves the plant. So a pretty significant chlorine dose on the sedimentation basin. And so what does that do to our DBPs? If you look at trihalomethanes, right at the end of the sedimentation basin, the settled water, it was already up to 40, and that's basically what it left the plant at. So you've got a significant amount, basically all of your THMs in the plant being formed before it ever even hits the filter. And then the haloacetic acids, they increase from around 15 or so steadily throughout the plant up to a little above 30. So, for this plant, you maybe could evaluate to see if this chlorine dose is a little bit high. There is some significant demand here between flocculation and settled water. What is that from? Maybe they need it for something, but it could be part of this could be going to the formation of these DBPs as well. So, just something to consider. Maybe we could take that dose down. Just in Arkansas, I would say if you were up around 2.7 or so on a pre-oxidation of free fluorine, I would probably recommend at least looking at turning that down. And then, here we've got a note that says the haloacetic acids and the total trihalomethanes are available in about 4 weeks, about a month. So let's say they did want to make this change, and then they take a sample immediately or within a day or two once the plant's had a time to turn over. You're still looking at a month before you know how you're doing. So, that's this particular plant. If they're using certified samples, you get numbers that you can really rely on, but the trade-off is, you're a month out every time you get ready to see how a change is being impacted. All right, so let's look at a water system in Arkansas. This is one that I worked on some, and it's a groundwater system, and they have had trouble with THMs just historically. They do use chloramines as a secondary disinfectant, and in spite of that, we're still having trouble meeting the regulations with regards to DBPs. So we did 3 plant profile studies, and on each profile, we did THM plus, free and total chlorine, free ammonia, monochloramine, and temperature. And then we'll take a look and see kind of what happened throughout this this case study. All right, so here is a look at the first profile we did. And so there's a few things on this just to kind of point out. THM plus is the orange line, and that's kind of the thing that we're most interested in as far as what's going on here. One thing that I almost forgot to mention: the filters. They're shown down here at the bottom: filter 1, filter 2, and an average of the filters. Just to point out that that's kind of one process that takes up a chunk of the graph that you could just kind of imagine this chunk here kind of being compressed into one thing. We also monitored monochloramine, which is the purple line, and you see it a little bit here at the beginning, but then kind of spike towards the end, which is kind of what you'd expect. And then free ammonia as well. So this study was conducted on April 21st, and we were able to get back to our office, run the THM plus, and then get those numbers to them and say, let's look at what's going on. Here is so that was everything with the exception of free chlorine. We put free chlorine on a different graph just to it's the one that we're kind of most concerned with regards to its relation with THM plus, and so we'll show it on a graph by itself. And here it is, and you can see how it tends to track with THM plus. So on our first visit there, another thing kind of worth noting here is our raw water coming in, no chlorine added. This is straight from the wells. It was coming in, close to 30. So we know for sure that that's not true THM data because there's not been any chlorine added to it. There's not going to be any chloroform or bromoform. Any of that stuff is going to be, none of that's going to be present in the water without chlorine. So we already know for sure that just our baseline is running a little bit high for this water quality. And through the aerator, it has also not received any chlorine as well. But prior to the clarifier, they do add chlorine, and you can see a jump up in free chlorine and a corresponding jump in THM plus. All right, so what do we find here? The majority of the THM plus formation is happening in the clarifier, and that they were adding some chlorine prior to this. One of the things that they were already considering doing prior to our involvement here was to clean out the clear well. In the past, they had cleaned the clear well and had success with lowering THM results after doing so. However, after this profile, we looked at the numbers and we were pretty confident that they needed to do some other in-plant optimization work as well. One of the things that came up during the visit was that they were not aware that they had naturally occurring ammonia in the raw water. And so you can see that right here on this blue line, they had a fair amount of free ammonia in their water, and they were making chloramines anyway. And so the thought was to try to see if they could utilize some of that naturally occurring ammonia to produce chloramines in the clarifier. And this next site visit, which the first site visit was on April 21st, and we were back out there to them on June the 3rd, after they had tried to make some changes. And so you can see now that their free ammonia drops to 0 in the clarifier because they were trying to use it to make monochloramine, to varying success. One of the things that we ran into here and some other parts in Arkansas is some places, especially here, that have naturally occurring ammonia, it's very variable as far as one day you might have enough to make chloramines from, and the next day you may not. And it also makes it difficult to know, dosing, what you're going to dose if that number is fluctuating. It's all based on a ratio, and therefore, if that number is changing, your chlorine dose will be changing based around it. And if it's not automated, it's a difficult thing to try to chase. So on this visit, we went out and you can see, once again, THM Plus is in orange, and by their end of their clarifier, they're running close to 140, and it's pretty high. So we were there on June the 3rd, came back, ran the results, plugged them in the computer, and here's the graph of free chlorine alongside THM Plus, and you can see it's pretty condemning as far as where the chlorine is added and where it is, where the DBPs are forming, and the clarifier was the culprit here. And even after the free chlorine was used later to go ahead and make monochloramine, they don't have any aeration or anything to remove the DBPs, so they stay elevated. All right, so what do we do from there? So we tried to do the monochloramine in the sedimentation basin to no success. We believe they had variable free ammonia, and it was just not working out. So we encouraged them to try to, instead of having free chlorine or monochloramine in the clarifier, to try to remove the chlorine from that process. They had the ability to add permanganate, and so they started using that as well prior to this. So this visit is on June the 10th. So on the first visit, it was April 21st to June the 3rd to June the 10th. So in a month and a half, we have been able to go through a couple of iterations, and at this point, you'll be able to see that our THM Plus leaving the plant at this point in time was below 20, which is a vast improvement from what it was. You can see the free ammonia is still getting used up a little bit, but not all of it prior to the clarifier. And one other note that I failed to mention earlier is that on these graphs, pay attention to the numbers and not so much the scale. The scale helps. They're varying scale. So the highest THM Plus shown in this one is 50, and the last one it was like 160. So if they were all on the same scale, it would be hard to distinguish the trends and the changes in the lines. But just remember that they were running north of 140 1 week prior to this. And then here is free chlorine plotted alongside THM Plus, and you can see, even here, here's a kind of a weird number in the aerator, over 40. There hadn't been any chlorine added at that point in time. You know, what can I say? THM plus sometimes gives you weird numbers. It does, but it also gives you valuable numbers at times as well. So as this went ahead and trended on out, you know, you can kind of see that very, very little free fluorine shown here, down around the detection limit of the machine that we were using. So, you know, these might even have been zeros in reality. So, you know, we were able to, at this particular system, provide fairly quick turnaround times as they implemented operational changes, and THM Plus was the tool that allowed us to do so. It allowed us to identify the problem and then also say, hey, it looks like we've got a good solution here as well. So that is, oh, I should have clicked onto this slide earlier, but you know, they did optimize their chloramination process and making monochloramine. And at this point in time as well, they were struggling with their residuals because of their experiments with their free ammonia, their naturally occurring free ammonia. And so we were encouraging them to go through extensive flushing efforts, to which they did, and they were good about making sure they were turning over the water very quickly. And you know, ultimately, this resulted in them having a significantly lower DBP level leaving their plant than what they had. And they currently are in compliance. It's a good story for this plant. I will say they have had trouble intermittently. So they use permanganate as one of the preoxidants now, and it's more expensive than their chlorine. As one of the things that Allison was talking about earlier is the unintended consequences. You know, they were getting some oxidation of manganese through that with the chlorine, and as they reduced it, they lost some of their oxidation of manganese and started to carry over some manganese as well. They can control it with permanganate. However, it is more expensive. So they try to toe the line between, can I put a little bit of chlorine and maybe a little bit of permanganate, and they'll get some elevated numbers and they'll back off the chlorine and bump up the permanganate. So it's kind of a balancing act for them, but it's a success story as well. So, you know, in summary, it's not a perfect tool, but it can be very effective at identifying problem areas, especially when you're doing it in a profile. Using it for a profile, it really shines there. It is a lower cost and a quicker turnaround time as well. It's really beneficial for, especially, you know, you can do this method in the field. It's easier to bring it back to a dedicated lab space, but you can do it in the field if you're wanting to do things, you know, give results day of. You can do that, and you know, it can help identify both in-plant monitoring and distribution system monitoring. It can benefit significantly from THM Plus use. You know, I'll use it for a profile in a plant. I'll also use it for a profile in distribution system to try to identify, you know, well, looks like this tank might be the issue in a distribution system. So with that said, I think that wraps up my portion of the presentation. Yep. And, you know, if you've got questions, feel free to type them in and I'll handle them in the next presentation. With that, I'll turn it over to Jackie.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Jackie Logston, and David Messer and I work with the Drinking Water Technical Assistance section within the Department of Environmental Protection. And we're going to be talking to you about, hold on just a second, let me make sure that I've got everything here. Optimizing a water plant to control DBPs. I'm going to go through the background with you implementation approach, optimization tools that we have available to us. And then I'm going to turn it over to David, and he is going to go through the optimization, implementation, and activities, including monitoring, oxidant changes, TLC removal, jar testing, and then a case study. Kentucky has participated in the area-wide optimization program for a long time. We've participated for over 20 years. In the beginning and for most of that time, we always focused on optimizing treatment. But then when stage 2 came along, we were faced with a lot of systems out of compliance, MCL, DBPs. And when we were trying to come up with a strategy of how to help these systems and to improve compliance, we thought, you know, we have all of these tools available to us through AWOP. Let's see if we can use them for compliance assistance, just like we've used it for optimization. It's the same process to, you teach the systems, the operators, the same things when you're working on optimization as you do when you're trying to help them achieve compliance. So we would start with systems, and we would do initial monitoring to determine where the problem is. Is it a distribution system issue? Is it a water plant issue? Of course, we're dealing with a lot of consecutive systems out of compliance, and so we've done a lot of distribution system optimization trainings. But for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to talk about a lot of the targeted technical assistance that we've provided. TTA is one-on-one system-specific assistance. And for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to talk about our primary approach for improvements in the water plant. We have several different ways of selecting a system for targeted technical assistance. Sometimes it's just the system giving us a call and saying, I need help, can you come help? But we do have a process that we go through. We do AWOP rankings every year where we go through and come up with a system for ranking the systems based on performance, worst performing to best performing, and try to focus our efforts on those systems that are at the top of that list. We also look at systems that are in enforcement. We have some systems that will actually put some of these AWOP tools in the corrective action plan that they have submitted in response to an agreed order when they're in enforcement. But even before systems make it to enforcement, we're looking at that enforcement targeting tool total points to see if that's a system that we need to be working with to prevent them from going to enforcement if possible. Really, our focus right now is looking at parent systems that have consecutive systems out of compliance, even though the parent system is in compliance. And then we have found good use of our time working with multiple systems that may have the same source, because what's working at one system may very well work at another system. And then really we're working with systems that have a lot to do. There are several optimization concepts that have not been implemented. We have a lot of systems in Kentucky that still pre-chlorinate, and many of these systems can remove additional TLC by making some operational and treatment changes, and have that potential to reduce the DBP formation in the treatment process. And we do make an effort, and that really is what AWOP is about, is making the best with what you have. So we do work with these systems and start with what they already have in place without making any major treatment changes. We will go in and take a look at the chemicals that they're already feeding and optimizing that process before we change anything, and try to do it at as minimal a cost as possible for that system. And then I'm going to talk about unintended consequences as well, like Allison did on the first presentation, because there are some unintended consequences whenever you're looking at optimization. When you reduce the CT, or when you move that point of chlorination, you're going to reduce the CT. And in Kentucky, we require a system to get approval before they can move that point of chlorination, because we need to make sure that the adequate CT is going to be met before any application point of chlorine is moved. A lot of systems report algae growth in their sedimentation basins once they've removed that chlorination from the rapid mix in the plant. Increased chemical costs. A lot of times systems are feeding a coagulant for optimal turbidity removal, but maybe not taking that extra step for that optimal TOC removal. Or maybe they're not feeding a preoxidant, or they might start feeding a carbon. So all of that may come with some additional chemical costs. And then we've also run into chemical salespeople and engineering folks that are contract working with these systems they may not be happy with some of the advice that we're giving them, because they're wanting to keep the system's business. And our objective is helping that system to achieve compliance. Like I said, we do start with what they already have in place. That's not our intent, but that can happen. And then we run into systems that are reluctant to change. They've always done it this way. Why should we have to change now? It's worked for 30 years. Why should we be doing it differently now? Systems that have not fed a permanganate, and even some systems that have stopped because they are concerned with pink water. So that's a big hurdle sometimes that we have to overcome. And then operators have to get away from the set it and forget it operation. You really have to be on top of your game, paying attention to what's going on in the treatment process. So I want to talk here about optimization tools that we utilize. A big part of that is monitoring. Aaron was talking about profiling the plant. That's something that we do too. We go in and we will profile the plant. We monitor at different stages throughout the plant, and we'll even go on and do some distribution system monitoring. If we're dealing with a consecutive system out of compliance, or if we're dealing with a water system and we have identified the major issue to be in the distribution system, we'll do a more extensive distribution system profile. But when we're profiling the plant, we like to go ahead and grab some distribution system data too to go along with it. And things that we'll monitor, for sure we'll monitor TTHMs and HA5s, TOC, and we'll send those off to our lab for analysis. And there is a lag time in that. It's about 3 or 4 weeks here as well. So we do have to wait for that data to come back. Something that Dave is going to talk more about later on in the presentation, I'm going to talk about here in a slide or two, is the use of UV254 as a TOC surrogate. And then we will check chlorine, pH, temperature. So those are the parameters that we're looking at whenever we profile the plant and do some distribution system monitoring. This monitoring helps us to identify a baseline so that we know that when the system goes in and implements some control strategies, we know if it's helping and if it's not. And if it is helping, how much is it helping? Is it worth the additional effort? Those sorts of things. It helps us to identify where those DBPs are being formed. Aaron gave a good example of that in his presentation, because you've got to know where to start. And so with this monitoring, we can determine whether it's plant-based or distribution system-based. And then from there, where in the plant is that formation happening? And what can you do about it? And then these plant profiles will be conducted at different times throughout the year to evaluate the effectiveness of the operational changes and also the effect of changing seasons. If you were on the first webinar, Paul from Pennsylvania gave a good presentation on distribution system influent hold studies. We do these here in Kentucky too, and we'll do these whether we're focusing on the plant or the distribution system because of the valuable information that you gain from it. This study is looking at the DBP formation potential and the chlorine demand. Allison mentioned it too when she was talking about the stability of the water, and changes that you make can change the stability of the water. And so doing this evaluation, this hold study before and after control strategies have been implemented, can really help evaluate the changes in the treated water by seeing if you have affected that reactivity. Very reactive water can suggest inefficient treatment. And then again, it's used to estimate water age in the distribution system. So I mentioned the UV254 earlier, and this is a tool that David's going to talk more about. And he really likes to use this because it's a very good TLC indicator or surrogate. It's a measurement of light absorbed by organic compounds at 254 nanometers. I do want to mention that the results can be impacted by oxidation and interference. In particular, chloramine can interfere. So if a system is using chloramines, that can be an interference here. But really, aside from those impacts, it really is the best surrogate that we've got when we're looking at TLC. Typically, as that UV254 number trends downward, so do the DBP levels. It's quick, it's easy, you have immediate results. It does require a basic filtration when you're analyzing, and it's reasonable cost. Another tool that we use is jar testing. And again, I mentioned that many times the coagulant is used for if its effectiveness is measured by the amount of turbidity that is removed. But when you're looking at DBP formation, you really have to focus on what kind of TLC reduction you're getting. And so what Dave will do in his jar testing is he can run the jar tests, look at different dosages of the coagulants, and then run that UV254 right on the spot, get some data, run another set of jars, run another set of coagulant, varying dosages or varying types of coagulants, run the UV254. And so you can really get a lot done in a short amount of time when you're looking at the coagulation process using the 254 and jar testing. The jar testing, we use it to also evaluate the performance of pre-oxidation dosages, and Dave's going to talk more in detail about that when he gets to his part, and evaluating the performance and application point of the powdered activated carbon. And then as a last resort, there is a high operator resistance to this, but if all else has failed, if we need to look at pH adjustment, that's something else we can evaluate in the jars. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to turn it over to David Messer, and he is going to talk to you about his optimization implementation activities and some case studies.
All right, thanks, Jackie. Generally, whenever I go to a facility, I like to see what type of plant it is before I go out. I like to take a look at the raw water sources, review some of the recent data they've taken on DBPs, TOCs, and what have you out in the system. And also I like to have a talk with their inspectors to see what the inspectors have got to tell me. They usually are in the plant fairly frequently, and they're pretty aware of what's been going off and what they've tried, what they're seeing. And I also like to talk to rural water. In Kentucky, the rural water circuit riders and whatever are out there, and they're helping these systems, and usually they've been in there, especially if they're in enforcement, and they're talking to them. And when it comes to the data, I especially like to see if they've got DBP plant tap data. Usually if they're in a enforcement case, that data will be available. And then when I actually go to the facility, I like to just take a general plant tour. Sometimes I've never been in these plants, so I want to see what they're actually doing. I like to look at their chemical feed points. I like to look and see what capabilities they actually have. Can they feed dry powders? Can they feed liquids? And what are they actual feeding? I've been told, things, doses that they were using, and when you actually get into the situation, take a close look at it, you find out that maybe they weren't feeding what they thought they were feeding. So I like to look at all that, and then I like to go in and see what kind of raw iron and manganese levels they have in the raw water. Usually, a lot of the systems I've dealt with were not treating for those. They were using chlorine to oxidize the iron and manganese, and they weren't trying to actually remove them with another preoxidant. I like to take a close look at the coagulation process, see what kind of doses they're using and what the results are, and have a talk with the plant personnel and just ask them what they've been doing, what they've tried to do, and what seemed to work for them, what didn't seem to work for them. And then, if possible, while I'm there, I'll go ahead and start my initial plant and distribution monitoring. Sometimes it'll take a couple of days to do the initial monitoring, especially if the plant's a long way off, but generally I like to get that done to start with. I'll look at the TOC levels through the plant at each process point and maybe a couple of points out in the system. I also like to do the UV254 absorbance measurement after each plant process and out in the system. And I'll look at pull a DBP sample after each plant process, after it's been chlorinated. And we'll look at all the plant tap parameters and go out in the distribution system, maybe take a master meter sample or two, maybe some compliance sites. And if operators just point out some areas where they have high residence times on their maps, we may go out there and pull a couple samples initially. And we're just trying to determine what the extent of the problem is, what levels we're seeing at different places. And it also gives me a tool to compare our activities against. Sometimes folks will be hard to convince that something you're doing is working, but if you've got the data to show changes and the effects, it makes things a lot easier. All right, I'm giving you this is some data for a plant profile at the City of Manchester. And Manchester was adding chlorine to the flash. They had a little bit of iron, a little manganese, and they didn't have any, they weren't feeding any permanganate as a preoxidant. They were basically adding chlorine to the flash and letting chlorine do the work. I did this profile because a subsequent system, a purchasing system, had been referred to enforcement. The producing system were not out of compliance at the time. Their numbers were on the upper side of the range, but they were in compliance. And I had done some distribution sampling in the purchasing system and had found that at the master meter coming to them, some of their numbers were in the 60, 70 range, depending on what time of the year I sampled. So I knew that the producer was using up most of the limit, for lack of a better word to say it. So I knew that we'd need to go back and do some work at the producer to try to get things lined up. And like I say, the profile data here that we did was simply to demonstrate to the producer that you may be handicapping your purchaser there. All right, this is just a graph of the plant profile produced from that data. You can see that the TOC dropped fairly quickly and then flatlined. And you can see the THMs kind of continued to build all the way to the purchaser's master meter, but most of them were produced by the plant tap. The master meter in this case was a fairly close to the plant, and the purchaser purchased a lot of water, so there was a lot of turnover through that line. So it didn't have a lot of time to generate TTHMs, HAAs, etc. So the results indicated what we had found in the distribution sampling, that the plant was a significant contributor to the problem associated with the purchasers' problems there. And we did some follow-up sampling in September of that same year. The TTHMs were running up around 72 at the purchaser's master meter. And based on this data, the plant started feeding permanganate as a preoxidant. They also reduced the chlorine level. They never did completely eliminate chlorine in the flash, so they were feeding permanganate in a pre-flash, and they were feeding a lower level of chlorine in the flash. And subsequently, the fourth quarter of 18, they had a plant tap of 14.1. I didn't have this on a graph for that, but they did have what the operator told me was one of the lowest levels they had since they've been monitoring that particular system. But anyway, that's what a plant profile that we done would look like. As Jackie had mentioned, all those samples were done by the state lab here in Kentucky, and they've supported us in all this monitoring. They seem to do all the samples we want done, so it makes it work a lot better for us.
Hey David, can I just interrupt
yes.
for one quick second? Can you turn your slideshow into a slideshow? Just start the slideshow from right where you're at.
Right here. Let me find it.
Yep, the icon right up at the top, right up there, all the way over. 1, 2, 3, 4 to the right. There's a little icon right there.
I'm looking there.
Yeah, that's the one. Perfect.
There you go. Sorry about that.
It's all good.
Get back to where I was at. All right. Generally, some of the things that we have been doing, a lot of our systems are using chlorine in the flash mix. And we've been trying to get that point of chlorination moved, if possible, because we've seen, based on plant profiles, we've seen a lot of the DBP formation coming in the plant in the said basins. And it seems like that it's just difficult to get them low as we'd like to see them without doing something. So we like to take a look at other preoxidants. Typically, for the systems I've been working with, that preoxidant of choice has been sodium permanganate or potassium permanganate. Generally, it's fairly easy for us to implement, and I like the fact that it does address the iron and manganese that's in some of the raw water. And to do that, we'll go through a demand test. Before we actually change things. So the way I like to do a demand test, I know there's jar testing procedures you could do that with, but I want to find out how much permanganate I need to address the iron and manganese. And plus, I'd like to do add a little more to address organics prior to actually introducing the chlorine to the system. So the way I tend to do it is I'll take a clean white bucket. I'll add about 20 liters of raw water to it, and then I'll dose that bucket with sufficient permanganate to achieve the results that I'm looking for. And the results I tend to look for are I'll feed a sufficient amount to address the iron, which is about a ratio of 0.84 to 1. I'll feed enough to address the manganese, which is about a 1.71 to 1 ratio. I just usually use a 1 to 1 and 2 to 1. Makes it pretty simple. And then I'll add some additional permanganate, maybe a half a part or so, to try to address the organics that are in there. And then I'll kind of mix the bucket up real good, and then I'll just sit and observe it. And if that pink color goes away in less than 30 minutes, I like to add additional permanganate. I want it to stay a pink color in the bucket for at least 30 minutes. And that's just something that, through observation, it just seems to work for me, at least for the water here in Kentucky that I've had to deal with. And in cases where I don't really have a basin or anything to get my holding, if I can keep that 30-minute time period acceptable, I'll do that, or I'll look at a conventional plant with a couple of flocculators, and I'll have them to add sufficient permanganate to keep the water a pink color to the end of the first flocculator. So as long as it's starting to disappear or disappeared at the beginning of the second flocculator in the series, then generally that dose tends to work for me. It'll convince the operator too that he's probably not going to see any pink water go through. If he's got 2 or 3 hours holding time through his set basins, and you're showing him that the water will change color and the pink will be gone in 30 minutes, generally it's comforting to them, and they'll go ahead and let you do it or work with you and get it done. And the same goes for letting the color disappear after the first flocculator. All right, the next chart is a chart of a UV 254 absorbance values at a facility, and out in the early part of December, or at the end of December of 18, they were feeding chlorine with no permanganate. They didn't have a UV 254 instrument, but we had gotten one here at the state and took it up there, and we monitored the UV 254 absorbance in the raw water at the end of the trains. It was an active flow train, and also at the plat tap. You can see up until about early January, that was the data with just strictly chlorination. On around 15th of January, they added a sodium permanganate feed in the raw water coming in. We really didn't have a lot of residence time, but we went ahead and started anyway, and you can see that there was a drop or a shift in the UV absorbance level at the plant tap. And that shift continued on out through the present data. I did see, I'd like to point out that there was one other thing done. At the end of the train values, you see it shift and then it peaks up with the raw water. It appears to be turbidity related or rainfall event related for that peak. And then when you go out through toward the end of the year, or into the data set, that peak did not occur. In the neighborhood of the middle of February, the facility had changed the sand in their active flow system. They had put I think it was a coarser size sand. They thought they would improve the settling or whatever. And they were having high top of the filter turbidities, or what we considered high, between 1 and 2 a lot of times. They weren't meeting the AWOP goals. And they changed back their sand to the spec, the original spec from the engineering firm. And the top of the filter turbidity started going back down below 1. And I see what appears to be a trend down on the UV 254 results taken at the end of the train. And I don't see out there at the turbidity event, I don't see a spike going up on that one. So it appeared that could be another impact as far as the UV 254 reading we were getting at the end of the train. But yeah, it's just interesting, and I'm not real sure yet how that's going to work. But the sampling that came out of this system, the latest sampling, they were in the mid-20s now, coming out of the plant with the DBPs, and which were significantly below what they were, and they are back. I think they were referred to enforcement, and I think this last quarter they were in compliance, if I remember correctly. So we're going to stay on this course and through the summer and into the fall, and see if this holds steady through that time period, which we think it will. And our jar testing, we do the jar testing to try to optimize the coagulation with both goals of turbidity as well as organics removal. Historically, most of our plants have not really evaluated organics removal in a system at their coagulation point. They were just running everything off turbidity. And what we have found is the UV 254 absorbance number tends to trend down as our organics tend to trend down. So it seems like it's a real good indicator when I'm jar testing or if I'm working in the plant that if I can get the UV 254 absorbance number to go down, then generally my results will look better. And when I'm jar testing, I usually start with the systems product and the dose rate based on what I've found historically. And then usually I'll have to increase that dose. Most of the plants in our area are using the aluminum packs, the 10% aluminum. I've heard it called the pressurized packs in the trade. And they'll give you, they're highly reactive. They really like to grab the turbidity and settle it. But usually, from my experience, I'll have to increase the dose 10 to 30% to get the maximum organics removal for the product they're using to achieve the DBP reduction we're looking for. And in some cases, we do try different products or something like that if whatever we've got is just not working. Folks will be glad to give you a sample and let you try it somewhere. All right, in powdered activated carbon, some of our systems are using some powdered activated carbon, most are not. Just based on experience, there is a significant difference between the various powdered activated carbons. Most of the purchasers at a lot of plants want to buy whatever's cheapest. They want to bid it, and whatever comes in cheapest, what you'll use. This is not a very good practice. You need to jar test the carbons. You need to do plant trials, and you need to determine which is the best performing product. And you also need to take a look at the application point. The recent example for, when we were trying to remove geosmin, which is not the same as the TOC, but it's a good example. The plant was using a cheap, I call it generic carbon, that you'll see in a lot of facilities. They were getting about 50% removal of the geosmin coming into the raw water. We did some tests with jars, did some filtration, sent the samples off. We were able to get that up to 70-75% removal just by selecting a different carbon, different grind, different source. And then we went out and took a look at the system they were feeding in the flash mix with the coagulant. We moved it to the center well of it was an upflow clarifier. So we moved the carbon feed point to the center well and ended up getting over 90% removal just by changing those two things. And don't know how much difference in the cost was, but the performance was just daylight and dark. The geosmin and MIB at that system at times was so bad you couldn't hardly drink the water. And as far as I know, we've not had a complaint in quite some time now. So the dose, the type carbon, and the application points are fairly important. And the dose for TLC removal and carbon may be fairly high. The geosmin levels we had to go to at that plant were 20 parts per million, which is extremely high. It's fairly costly. So the powdered carbon may not be feasible to get a significant TLC removal. And then there's also a lot of operational challenges feeding powdered carbon at that levels. It's difficult with carbon feeders, and some folks are trying to use these liquid carbons, which are very low carbon content. Either way, it gets fairly expensive, and you have to use a lot of product. All right, we've got a case study here for the Martin County Water District. Some of the background is they were referred to enforcement for disinfection byproduct violations. They had attended a distribution optimization system training. They were feeding a low dose of a 10% aluminum coagulant and a polyacrylamide to help with flocculation of the coagulant. They were pre-chlorinating with bleach in the center well of the clarifier. They had the capability of feeding liquid carbon and sodium permanganate, but they were not using either one. And they had a very active citizens group in the community. They had, through Facebook, social media, whatever, had got a hold of Erin Brockovich, and she'd done a little video for them and sent her expert water treater down to take a look at the situation. So the atmosphere was not the best up there, but they were, I guess, they thought everybody was out to get them. Here's a picture of I think they're called hydrotreaters that was in Martin County Water. You can see the top of the tube settlers. You can see the troughs come out in like a wagon wheel spoke design. And I wanted to take note of this picture that when we talk about the chlorination ring, we actually made a little ring around that center well, laid it on top of the troughs, and drilled holes in it over each trough. So when we talk about that, you'll have a visual of what it is we did. But the water didn't look too bad. Top of the filter, or the top of the cone, wasn't awful. All right, and when we got there, we took a look at the CT times to see if we could move that point of chlorination somewhere beyond the center well of the clarifier. We did plant profiles, did a couple of them at various points through the system, and we tested iron and manganese in the raw water, and we jar tested for coagulant feed rates and effectiveness. All right, and when we got all that work done, we found that we needed to increase the coagulant feed from about 18 parts up to 36 parts. And we built that homemade chlorination ring. The operator actually built it after we sat around and discussed a while, what was necessary and what we wanted to achieve. He just went and got some, I think it's called PEX pipe that they use in home plumbing, and made a ring out of it. We took a drill and drilled some holes in it to match the location of the weirs, laid it on top of the hydrotreater, and then we started pushing bleach through the ring into the troughs. We started feeding sodium permanganate, and eventually we started feeding copper sulfate to assist with algae control and taste and odor. The system, when we switched over and pulled it out of the centering, we had a couple of problems. One is when we switched over, within 2 days, 3 days, they were calling and said that they were seeing a scum forming on top of their clarifiers, which turned out to be algae. But they were kind of in panic mode, and as we were discussing, they said, well, what about just turning that ring a little bit and just put the chlorine on the surface of the water? And they did that, and the little skim just disappeared. And then also with the to feed the bleach, we used what I call push water or dilution water. We injected the bleach into a water line, went out there that led out to the ring, and to dilute the bleach down to where we get a little better and more even distribution of the bleach. When we did that, the water had a lot of calcium in it, and it started precipitating the calcium out when the bleach was injected into it, and started stopping our little homemade ring up there. And what we ended up doing there was we added a little polyphosphate. We got a hold of one of the manufacturer's engineering staff, told them what we were having. They agreed that the polyphosphate would be great to sequester the calcium. So we treated the water used to push the chlorine out with about 1 part of a polyphosphate. That addressed the precipitation and the plugging, and everything seems to be going fairly decently there. The next chart is a graph of the TTHM, the Martin County Water District. They've been in compliance now with the long-range running average for about 7 quarters, I think it is. And here's a graph for HAAs. Basically the same thing. They've been in compliance now for about 7 quarters. And I guess the summarization, we try to look at the things or the resources facilities have on site, so we can do what we need to do with a minimum cost. We take a look at the TOC removal practices and the optimization practice that we need to do or apply to achieve the results, I found that the technical assistance, directed technical assistance that is one-on-one, seems to provide some good results, at least for us. So anyway, I guess that's the end of our little presentation, but I guess I pass it back to Allison.
All right, this is Matt Alexander from US EPA. I'd like to thank all of our presenters. I'd like to thank Aaron Hilborn from Arkansas Department of Health and Jackie Logston and David Messer from Kentucky Department of Environmental Protection for contributing to today's webinar. And we'd also like to thank ASDWA for giving us the opportunity to participate in this webinar series. So before we start the question and answer portion of this webinar, I'd like to review today's webinar objectives. Our first objective was to understand the relevance of this webinar series in the DBP control strategies that we shared. I know that many states and water systems are challenged with DBP formation, so I hope this webinar series is relevant. Our second objective was to introduce approaches to prioritize DBP optimization control strategies in a water treatment plant. And that included Allison, her presentation on sharing an approach to review historical water quality data to prioritize control strategies. And Aaron shared how a DBP surrogate monitoring tool may be used to prioritize control strategies within a plant. And then Jackie and David shared studies that may be conducted to assess the effectiveness of implementing potential control strategies. So with that, I'm going to begin our question and answer session. We've got a few questions that people have submitted already. We are a little limited on time. We've got about 7 minutes for our question and answer session. I apologize. It's going to be cut a little short, but I'll try to get through as many questions as we can. If we don't get to your question, we will follow up with you or try to follow up with you offline. So with that being said, the first question is from Scott Wright, and I'm going to direct this question to Aaron Hilborn. Scott asked, Aaron, did you monitor TOC or DOC during your studies?
Hey, Scott. We did not on the case studies that I presented today. We will at some point in time do things like that. We knew going in that the precursor here at the water treatment plant that I was presenting today was bromide. It was brominated THMs was the issue they were having. So that was kind of the reason why we didn't do TOC. So.
All right, thank you, Aaron. The next question is from Joseph Crisolago, and I'm going to direct this question to Jackie and David. Joseph asked, any input over the use of alternative oxidants, such as chlorine dioxide, ozone, or peroxide in UV?
So, Joseph, we do have systems that utilize chlorine dioxide successfully. We didn't focus on it for the purpose of this presentation because the majority of the systems do choose to go with a sodium permanganate because of cost. With the chlorine dioxide, there's a big expense up front to get the equipment in to use that. Peroxide, we do see the use of peroxide, and that can be very effective for some systems. It's a quicker reaction. However, if a system has high levels of manganese that they're dealing with in the source water, peroxide's probably not the best option. Probably would be better off to go with a permanganate in that case. I don't have any experience with ozone or UV so much. Dave, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Well, the only thing I really got to add is that I do have a couple of systems that are using MIOX, mixed oxygen gases, and they're still having difficulties out in the purchasers end of the system. Generally, they've been getting good results in their system, but when it gets farther out, they're having difficulties in the purchaser system. And so, and I don't have anybody that's using chlorine dioxide. I've got one system that's using peroxide. They tell me that when they turn the peroxide off, they can see a 5-part difference in TTHM. Turn it back on, they'll see it go right back to where it was. I don't have enough data or studied that system enough to know if that's actually the case. But like I say, generally speaking, most of the systems in this area have iron and manganese for periods of time. So my preference has always been permanganate. It's cheapest setting a drum up and starting a pump. Okay.
All right, thank you both for answering that question. We got another question. This is from VC Rich from the state of Maryland, and I'm going to direct this towards Aaron. They wanted to know, how are THMs forming in the raw water? They said at 20 parts per billion in study 2. Do you know the speciation of the THMs? That is, for the groundwater example, were they more brominated THMs?
Yeah, they were brominated THMs. That's what it was. And the THMs you were seeing there on the raw water, that is a result from the THM Plus test. So there's something in the water quality, or we had a misstep in our technique or something where we got a reading of around 20, and it was just not accurate. There wasn't anything in the raw water THM wise. It's just what we got for the THM Plus when we ran it. So probably an interference of some kind. I don't know what it was. I'd just be guessing.
All right, thank you, Aaron. We've got another question from Joseph Crisolago. He asked, is any input over the use of reservoir mixing and water turnover with control and treatment of DBPs? I can cover that question. Actually, in webinar 3, we're going to be talking about storage tanks and their effects on DBP formation, and some potential control strategies that may be implemented, including mixing and water turnover within tanks. So please tune in to webinar 3 for more information about that, Joseph. We've got another question. This is from Michael Bleicher, and I'm going to direct this question towards Allison initially. Michael asked, can you share any references that provide intrinsic NTU values of various preoxidants to help in the selection of preoxidants for jar testing candidates for systems that have had prior turbidity issues?
Well, that's a good question, and I don't know any references off the top of my head. Matt and I have done some jar testing looking at preoxidants and measured turbidity and also DBP formation and residual, how long the water would maintain a residual with various preoxidants. And so the only preoxidants that we've used through that jar testing were permanganate and chlorine dioxide, and my recollection is that they had an equal impact on the turbidity, the settled water turbidity of the water, of that particular water that we evaluated with that coagulant dose. So my gut feeling is that there's probably not any good generalities about various preoxidants and their impact on turbidity, but I would also like to open that question up to Jackie and David and Aaron, and just wondering if you guys have worked with any water systems where you've worked with them to stop prechlorination and had to be sensitive to the preoxidant that you were using because of turbidity control, or if that was less of an issue by the time you were looking at filtered water turbidity.
You know, I was trying to think about that. I can't, nothing comes to mind. Probably the closest thing I have is this groundwater example where we're trying to limit their preoxidant and ended up, it wasn't turbidity, but manganese being an issue in the interim time. I can't think of one where we ended up running into a problem with turbidity.
Right.
I don't think that we've really seen a problem with that either.
Right. I know sometimes when we work with systems, we'll talk about stopping prechlorination, and the response will be, oh, no, we can't because of turbidity. It really helps with turbidity removal. But I think once you deal with some of those pre-oxidation demands and needs, like you're referencing, Aaron, and I'm sure you guys have had experience with in Kentucky, I think it kind of sort of takes care of itself. It's been my experience, but anyway, go ahead, Matt. Sorry,
All right.
I interrupted you.
Thank you. Looking at the time, it is after 3:30 Eastern time, and we were scheduled to wrap up at 3:30. So if we didn't get to your question this afternoon, we'll try to follow up with you offline. There are still a few remaining questions. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending this webinar, and please tune in 2 weeks on May 6th for webinar 3. Thank you and goodbye.